We've had this brick overmantel for more years than I can remember. By the way, I don't like that word, overmantel, because in our case it's both over and under the mantel. So I'm going to call it the chimney, even though that's probably not right. Anyway, my wife decided it was time to change it. I think her exact words were, "I've hated it for the last 10 years, or something like that. She wanted to cover it with shiplap. Something like this, in fact. The yellow matches the color of the opposite wall, by the way. So I watched some videos, including one by John Heist that I'll link in the description below, and I decided to try and make faux shiplap using plywood. Other than watching those videos, I had no idea what I was doing. I think it came out okay. My wife is very pleased, so that's all that really matters, right? Stick around and I'll take you through my process. So the idea was to take a sheet of 3/4 inch plywood and cut dados in it with a router so the planks would be about 6 inches wide. That didn't look quite right, so we eventually settled on 4 inches. I made the dados a 1/2 inch wide and about 3/8 of an inch deep. I had this Harbor Freight router lying around for my router lift build video, so I decided to use it for this project. It's pretty inexpensive, but it works surprisingly well. It even accepts 1/2 inch shanks and has adapters for 3/8 and 1/4 inch shanks. I pretty much destroyed the 1/2 inch bit that came with it during this project, but that's probably because I cut each dado in one pass instead of two. I made a router jig pretty much like the one John Heist made in his video, although I added a handle. It has a runner on the end that runs along the edge of the plywood to cut the first dado. Then the runner fits in the dado you just cut, so you cut the next dado at about the same distance. I built the jig using a piece of 1/4 inch hardboard I had lying around. The runner goes here. It's just slightly smaller than a 1/2 inch, so it can slide in the dado. Then from here to here is 6 1/4 inches, which gave me 6 inch planks. I'll show how I changed it for the 4 inch planks later on. This is the center, and this is where I'll cut off the excess. I took the base plate off the router and used it to mark where the screw holes go. Perfection is irrelevant here, so I just got it close to centered. I drilled 3 pilot holes, then flipped it over to drill the counterbores for the screw heads. Then I drilled out the remainder of the holes for the screws, slightly oversized. It fit okay, so I drilled out the center hole for the router bit using a 1 inch Forstner bit. It didn't need to be a Forstner bit, but that's the 1 inch size bit I had. I used some 1/4 inch hardwood for the runner. After cutting it to length, I cut it to width. I couldn't use my thin strip push block for this, so I used a gripper. I checked it with a caliper to make sure the width was right, so it would slide smoothly in the 1/2 inch dado, and I ended up trimming it a little more. I glued the runner on using some CA glue and activator. I'm using Gorilla Super Glue, which is Gorilla's version of CA glue. I just added some small drops of glue to the board and sprayed the runner with stick-fast activator. It dries in a handful of seconds. The problem with using CA glue is that it's brittle, so a jolt could break it apart. That turned out to be a good thing since I glued it to the wrong side. So I broke it off with a hammer, sanded it smooth, and added it to the correct side. I trimmed off the unused portion of the board, and I'm ready to go. I set the depth using these Craig router table setup bars. Then I cut the first dado. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't keep the runner flush with the bottom of the board. That's why I kept going back over the cut, so at least the top of the dado was straight, so the runner wouldn't get stuck when I cut the next dado. I even had the problem in the final version, but I fixed it using some JB Weld Quickwood and a straight edge. After some sanding and painting, you can't even tell. I was about to cut the second dado when I realized that doing this on the top of my table saw is a terrible idea. I've had router bits slip before and cut into the workbench. Having that happen in my cast iron tabletop, well, let's just say
it would be bad.
So I did the rest on the ground with the stock on top of some 2x4s. After I finished the dados, it was pretty obvious the 6 inch planks just didn't look right, so we decided to go with 4 inch planks. But I figured I should go ahead and cut all the pieces I could to make sure my measurements were right. And anyone who's watched my channel before knows that of course the dimensions weren't correct. So I decided I needed to make a quick SketchUp model. I mocked up the portion of the chimney I had to cover, triple checking my measurements so I started with the correct model. By the way, I measured the slope of my roof using a digital angle gauge. After I turned the camera off, I realized that measuring against the brick wasn't the best idea. So I went back and measured against the wall, and I ended up with the same result, which was about 112.5 degrees. If you subtract 90 from that, I end up with a fairly standard slope of 22.5 degrees, plus or minus. Back in my SketchUp model, I covered the chimney with my quote-unquote shiplap. The nice thing about doing this in SketchUp is that the material has thickness, so I don't have to trust my math to get the total dimensions correct. Which you'll have to take my word for since you can't read them in this image. Then I laid everything out against a 4x8 foot sheet, and that gave me my cut sheet. I modified the router jig to cut the dados 4 inches apart by breaking off the runner, sanding it, and moving it in 2 inches. Then I cut the dados, and vacuumed, and cut wood, and cut more dados. Then it was time to cut the 22.5 degree slope on the top. My new Makita cordless circular saw was easy to set up and use. And yes, that's a plug. I like this saw. Once I was done with that, I cut the excess off the bottom so it was the right height. Next up was to cut the 2 side pieces for the top. I cut them to width, then got ready to cut the top angles. I marked the top, then drew a couple of lines to remind me that the cuts need to go in opposite directions. I set a speed square along the top line, then pivoted around this end until I got to the 22.5 degree mark, or close enough, and drew the line. I did the same to the other one going in the opposite direction. Since I used a miter gauge to make the cuts, you could argue that I didn't need to draw the lines, but with the number of mistakes I make on a regular basis, I didn't want to take any chances. Some final cutting, and I was just about ready to hang the shiplap. Since I was going to use screws to hold the shiplap on, I tried to use a stud finder, but I didn't trust the results through the brick, so I went the old-fashioned way and drilled a bunch of test holes. I managed to get the top pieces to line up properly and attach to the chimney. I had made some marks on masking tape, so I knew where to drill the holes. Then I took everything down and did a little sanding. But my wife wanted a rough look, so I didn't do a lot of sanding. My wife did the painting. She doesn't know I took this video, by the way. I'm sure she'd want you to know that she's wearing her painting clothes. Then I reattached the shiplap. I covered the screws with some putty, and my wife did the final paint touch-up. Not bad for an old man who didn't really know what he was doing. Special thanks to John Heiss for his shiplap video, and to my friend Matt Jackson over at Next Level Carpentry for answering my questions and giving me sound advice, some of which I actually followed. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to leave a thumbs up.